Hi, Dennis Weiss. Welcome to Why Like Ike, and my goodness, you've done this just for me, haven't you? Tim Reed, Deputy Director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home, and you brought me a saddle.
Brought you a saddle, among other artifacts from the Old West, maybe put broadly, as well as some items, other items from that time period that Ike enjoyed. And
okay, what's our topic? What are we going to tell people?
Well, generally it's Ike and the Old West, the popular culture of the Old West, the way the Old West, or his idea of the Old West, influenced his thinking as a president, gifts that were sent to Ike that are kind of related to that time period. So a fairly broad swath today, but it was a subject that was dear to Eisenhower and something he found of great interest.
You know, I really enjoyed when we filmed Ike and Education. I learned some things during that filming, and it really heightened some thought for me about Eisenhower and how his development as a person went. And, you know, it's the most powerful man in the world at the time.
Absolutely.
The man who gave my most favorite saying, I think, that I say about Mr. Eisenhower, the man who gave the world a second chance at freedom. He also had hobbies. He also read books. He was just a regular guy, and this is so much a part of regular guy stuff. I love it.
And so many of the things that he loved, like golf, for example, sometimes his critics would seize on to show that he was either preoccupied with something other than the job at hand, or that he was kind of shallow. And so they were worried about his love of Western novels.
Really?
He was often photographed during the war reading a Western, and the story was, well, they just helped him relax, which I'm sure they did. But they were worried enough about it that a man wrote the White House in 1953 and said he had heard a talk from a professor who said that Ike read Westerns because he wasn't capable of reading anything else. And so the Chief of Staff, Sherman Adams, responds and says that was really just the president making a tongue-in-cheek comment about his liking for Western stories. And as a matter of fact, I'm quoting now, he never read Western stories until he found that helped him to relax before going to sleep. During his school years prior to West Point, the president was an avid student of the history of Greece and Rome. So again, trying to play that down. Well, then here's a letter from Eisenhower to a friend of his named Sig Larman.
Okay.
And he's thanking him for the gift of a really neat dime novel from 1882 about Wild Bill Hickok. And so Ike replies in a thank you note, "Dear Sig, needless to say I received the classics from the Old West with great glee. Although I must have read them back in Abilene, I have no doubt that I will be again caught up in the suspense of the tale." So here he is saying that he's been reading Western novels since Abilene. And what's interesting to me, his staff late in his life kept track of all the Westerns that he read. And so we have a list that they compiled near the end of his life. And I think it's every Western he read between November of '66 and then when he died in March of '69. It's about 206 books. And then he rates them. And he rated, rated Ernest Haycock's as his favorite. And Haycock's wrote a couple of books that involved Abilene. Haycock's also wrote the book The Wild Bunch that the movie was based on.
Okay.
And the book that Stagecoach. So he's a well-known Western writer. So he was the favorite. Rated as good was Louis L'Amour, whom everybody knows. Frank O'Rourke, whom I wasn't familiar with, and a guy named Peter Dawson. This is the Dawson book right here, called Ruler of the Range. Acceptable, Max Brand, and a big capitalized no, Zane Grey.
He didn't like Zane Grey.
Apparently not at this time in his life. He was not Zane Grey. It was usually Ernest Haycock's and Luke Short. And what's interesting, because I just found this out, Luke Short and Peter Dawson were actually brothers. And it was Frederick Glidden and Jonathan Glidden. And that was really common that these Western writers, because they could crank them out. I mean, they could crank out 4 or 5 books a year. And so they didn't saturate the market with one name. But again, we have dozens of these. Here's a couple by a guy named Tommy Thompson. And you can see from the title there, Bonanza.
Oh my.
That it has something to do with the TV series. Thompson was another Western writer who was also the producer of Bonanza. Here's another one by Thompson called Gunman Brand. And I brought this one because Thompson wrote Eisenhower and said that during the war, Ike was photographed reading Gunman Brand, and what a spike that put in the sales of his book. So he was thanking Ike for that promotion. Ike corresponded with a number of these authors. I think we have at least a half dozen or so who are pretty well known at that time, including Thompson. And Ike also then goes into some things about Western writers that he doesn't like, and one of which is the betrayal of the Frontier Army, which of course was near and dear to Ike. And I'll read just a paragraph from this letter to Thompson. He says, "The history of the period would seem to show no logical reason for this kind of characterization, negative portrayal of the Army. In those days, the entire regular Army was about 25,000 troops, while the part that was deployed to the Western states for protection was far from adequate. Nevertheless, by and large, it was a hard-working and efficient force and was led generally by intelligent and highly competent individuals. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, when I was a boy in Kansas, I knew many of the retired cowboys, stockmen, and retired soldiers of the Civil and Indian Wars. They tended to look upon the Army as the highly necessary policeman, to say nothing of a ready counselor and advisor." So it's interesting to me, maybe not a big surprise that he defends the Army, but he then talks about his boyhood here and knowing some of these characters from the Old West. And so, you know, there was, again, they wanted to downplay his interest in Westerns, but he clearly had it from an early age. A lot of it because he grew up here in Abilene, Kansas.
Sure.
Another one, he loved Western movies. And one of his favorite movies was High Noon, the classic with Gary Cooper and Grace Kelly. They had a famous theme song called "Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling." And White House staff confirmed that he used to walk around the White House whistling that tune. So when he was ill in the fall of 1955 from a heart attack, Dmitri Tiomkin, who was the composer and actually wrote well-known theme songs to a lot of Westerns, which is interesting because he was from Russia, sent Ike a special recording of the theme song in 7 or 8 different languages, including Hebrew, Yiddish, Swedish, Spanish, French, German, English, and Australian. So I'm really interested to hear what the Australian version of "Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling" sounds like.
You didn't bring an archive copy of that?
We're looking for it. We're looking to see if we have it.
Hey, I'm going to interrupt you, because I want to tell the folks at home, this is why we film Why I Like Ike. We could sit around at Joe Snuffy's and talk about what we think about Eisenhower and what his hobbies were and what he did in the war. But when we're here, you walk in with a sheaf of documents, and you open it up, and you start reading the history of Eisenhower that is preserved here. Because I'm not wondering what he thought. You just read it to me.
Yeah, here we have it.
And you have it right
words,
here.
yeah.
And that's available to any citizen that wants to come in and do this research and find out the answer to their question. That's why we love not only Ike the person, Ike the general, Ike the president, but Ike the institution.
And to share these stories.
Yeah, it's just hugely valuable to the future.
We also have some correspondence, some old-time Abilene residents would write Ike because they knew of his love of the Old West history, one of which was a guy named Sewell Haywood. And Sewell Haywood's father was a saddler and wrote a long letter to Ike. He wasn't here in Abilene, but his father knew Wild Bill Hickok in California. And he said worked on his bridles and saddles and his holsters. And so he sent Ike a round leather working tool. And he does not even claim that that was the one used on Hickok's saddle, but that was one of his father's tools and the type he used.
This is to cut leather,
back in
cut the heavy
century.
saddle leather.
That's right.
You just roll it down the line. Beautiful tool.
Another interesting letter is from a guy named Langston. His father was Ambrose Langston, lived here 1870 during the heyday of the cattle days. And Abilene had another well-known marshal, not just Wild Bill Hickok, but a guy named Tom Bear River Smith, who was known for his fist more than his prowess with a gun. Smith was killed between Abilene and Chapman by 2 men and shot and practically decapitated. It was a really gruesome murder. And so a posse from Abilene was sent after Smith's killers. And this gentleman's father was involved in that posse, and he writes this account of how his father was part of the group that chased down Tom Smith's killer. So again, these great little anecdotes of Western history coming into Eisenhower's record as a president. And so we never know what we're going to find in a day at work, and so it just always makes it exciting.
Okay, so let's talk about that saddle. Where did it come from? Well, how did it get to Eisenhower?
Yeah, that's another great one. Eisenhower received lots of gifts of this sort related to the West. This was in commemoration of the centennial of Fresno County, California, 1856 to 1956. And you could see the Old West scenes with the old storefront and the stagecoach and cactus and mountains in the background. The most amazing thing to me, it was made by a 14-year-old boy with the assistance of his father, who they said was one of 2 saddle makers left in California.
Okay.
So great piece of leather work.
And made in 56. It's interesting, or thereabouts, right?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Okay, so it's interesting the style of the saddle. It's got some old features, it's got some modern features. So, you know, I guess they made what they wanted to make to send to a president.
I could see Roy Rogers on that saddle.
Oh yeah.
It's got that look.
Yeah.
We have some spurs as well.
We have spurs, and they're kind of unique. They're not spurs to go with that saddle. They're the spurs to go with the saddle that Carl Weisenbach used to have in his office. And so they're really more of an English riding spur. But when I picked them up and looked at them, I said, I wonder what they put in the spur rowel gap. It's not the same metal. The spur rowel sits in there and has a pin, spins, but no rowels. And it looks like it's soldered, maybe. It's definitely different color than the silver spur, but very high quality stuff and very cool.
Well, that's another mystery we'll have to get the
there you go.
to look into.
You can find out all the answers here. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things you said, Tim.
Yeah.
That people were critical of Eisenhower because photos were published during the war of him reading a book, and so people stepped to his defense and said he does this for relaxation. Isn't it interesting, I guess? I don't like interesting as a word, but I'm on TV. So isn't it interesting that people will criticize such a thing to a man who has the fate of the world in his hands? A hobby of reading books about the culture in which he grew up would seem sort of logical to me.
Yeah, he grew up in the most famous cow town in the world. As he said, he knew some of the folks from that time period, so I think he would naturally be attracted to these books, and some of them have very good reputations as writers. Ernest Haycox was a favorite of Ernest Hemingway. Louis L'Amour has sold something now, they think, around 330 million books. So he wasn't alone in his reading taste. And again, I think it gave him that tie back to the Old West. As I mentioned, some of these folks corresponded briefly with him, and they were just flattered that he had an interest in their books. And they would send him entire boxes of their books.
I've read every Louis L'Amour book ever written. I've read every Zane Grey book ever written. Zane Grey's first book, The Riders of the Purple Sage, was written when he stayed in my little hometown of Dove Creek, Colorado, because when he wrote it, we had miles and miles and miles of 6 and 7 foot tall sage, which in the springtime when it rains is blue and purple and has the most delicious smell you can imagine.
Estimated.
But I'm shocked he didn't like Zane Grey.
Well, at least from the books he read during that time period.
He's a very descriptive writer. Maybe it was too much for his military mind.
Ike wanted more action, perhaps.
Yeah, there you go.
But we have records going back to World War II with his assistant, Bob Scholes, with the copies of the orders, and from all these different publishers, they were getting a box of books a month, and so I could really tear through them pretty quickly. I think it's probably much the same as someone who watches reruns of Law and Order late at night when they're trying to fall asleep. But then there was the serious part, I think, Ike's memory of the Old West, and he talks about it in this speech to the Anti-Defamation League in November of 1953, and the context are the accusations that Joe McCarthy's making. And what's interesting about this speech, it's off the cuff. No one wrote this speech for Ike.
All right.
And so I'll read just a little bit of it, and you'll get the idea. Ike told the audience, "I was raised in a little town of which most of you have never heard, but in the West it is a famous place. It is called Abilene, Kansas. We had as our marshal for a long time a man named Wild Bill Hickok. If you don't know anything about him, read your Westerns more. Now that town had a code, and I was raised as a boy to prize that code. It was, meet anyone face to face with whom you disagree. You could not sneak up on him from behind or do any damage to him without suffering the penalty of an outraged citizenry. But if you met him face to face and took the same risk he did, you could get away with almost anything as long as the bullet was in the front. And he goes on in that vein for a ways. But he's drawing again on his Abilene past to say what Joseph McCarthy's doing in terms of these sort of accusations is wrong and in violation of this code that he learned here in Abilene.
Well, that's the thing I learned today right there. So I can see Mr. Eisenhower speaking off the cuff on something of that matter, and I can completely understand him using Abilene and the Code of the West as a basis of logic, because that's who he was. That's who
exactly. So he liked it on both this kind of popular culture level. He liked the memorabilia of the West, and he also had that Westerner's view of this code of how you behave, towards others. If you have a problem with someone, you take it to them directly. You don't sneak around their back and spread rumors. And so it's more of this Abilene that you can see in Eisenhower that may not be as apparent all the time.
You know, we are in the 150th year of Abilene, Kansas as a cow town, and a lot of celebrations here this year, a lot of things going on. And so we're filming Why Like Ike, and you've picked this topic for us to discuss today. I think, first of all, President and General Eisenhower would be very happy that you picked this one, and that we're focusing on Abilene through the eyes of Dwight David Eisenhower. I think that would please him greatly.
Yeah, and showing again how his memory of this place, then
affected his
formed
entire
some of his
life.
actions and his thinking. Speaking of that commemoration and sesquicentennial of the Chisholm Trail, the Chisholm Trail, I found some correspondence on the centennial of the Chisholm Trail with Eisenhower and the folks over at Old Abilene Town, and he wanted to attend. In fact, the plan was then President Johnson would start the commemoration down in Texas, and it would end with former President Eisenhower here at the end of the trail in Abilene, but he was sick and he couldn't attend, and so he wrote a statement for those who came here to celebrate the centennial. So again, it was a subject that was never very far from his mind, and that he enjoyed not only his experiences and drawing up on the memories of the people here he knew, but also I think maybe kind of reliving that with these books that he was so fond of.
I appreciate, I grew up reading these kinds of books. We lived in the mountains of Colorado in a big, deep, rocky canyon. TV reception was only enjoyed by the people on the tops of the canyons, not the bottoms of the canyons. So we were great readers, our entire family. So I could go through all 4 of those books tonight very easily. The exercise of imagination comes through reading these kinds of books. The exercise of imagination allows one to apply that learned skill to other sets of problems as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Imagination is what it took to conceive that it was possible to land on the beaches of Normandy. Nobody drew that out day one. You first had to imagine that it would be possible, and then apply resources, people, skills to the concrete plan, to the devices that were invented, to the creation of all the things that it took to physically land on Normandy. I'm not saying you could prove this, or one way or the other. I'm not saying that it was Eisenhower's idea, but I'm saying he was responsible for it, and I would be strongly believing that his imagination helped drive something of the scope of which he was responsible for.
And with any hobby of his, he could become totally absorbed, whether it was painting or golf, and he could really compartmentalize and give his brain that break from that pressing business. And these Westerns, they would have played that same role. So they would have helped him in the war effort and as president. One other thing that's so interesting about the popular culture, especially the 50s, there were 35 Western shows on television. 8 of the top 10 television shows were Westerns, and the most popular movies were Westerns. So it was really that era as well.
99% of everybody watching TV was watching those shows.
That's right.
That's not true today.
No, in fact, I mean, how many Westerns are even on television or in the theaters anymore? It's very rare.
Well, we've got about 2 minutes, so a whole brand new topic for us today. We've
Yeah,
talked
yeah,
about
it's,
we've talked about almost everything Eisenhower, but we've never talked about really Western, really about and artifacts, because that's what you do and you guys do here. You put artifacts out in front of the camera to draw people's interest. Why like Ike? Well, there's, you name it. If you're interested in anything, there's some reference to it here at the library and the museum. We've got just a short period of time, a whole new future's opening up for this museum in 2018.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic what's happening here. So we'll keep making these shows to give people insight into what's going on at the library and museum, to give them some insight on what's coming behind the walls. But when it's done, it's going to be great.
And we'll never run out of ideas.
Never run out of imagination or ideas. Tim Reeves, thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Dennis.
All right, we'll be back next time and have more fun, because we like Ike, they do too. I'm Dennis Weiss, Tim Reeves. We are so glad you joined us today for Why Like Ike. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.